You were one of the prescient few years ago who said that an infectious disease outbreak was coming that could kill millions of people. How is what is happening now different from what you expected?
Well, sadly, I would say that the economic damage is much greater. I put $3 trillion for a respiratory virus spreading around the globe, and clearly we're going to go well beyond that. The whole goal of speaking out then wasn't to be able to say, I told you so when it happened. Rather, it was
In 2015, you gave more than $50 million to CureVac, which is really focused on this messenger RNA technology. How is that so different? And why did you see it back then, 5 years ago, that it could be such a transformative technology?
These mRNA vaccines will be among the vaccines that help end the pandemic. We've been investing in them for quite some time because they will eventually be very cheap, and you can have a factory that even once you want a new disease, you only have to change a tiny little bit of that factory to have it make a vaccine.
You know, there are moments in time
at the time didn't know where polio came from, and then we had to wait for the Salk and Sabin vaccine. Once those vaccines came out, people lined up in droves for those vaccines. So my hope is that this time will eventually remind people the importance of public health. We forget in this country that diseases like measles are way more infectious than COVID-19 is. I mean, for every person who gets measles, they tend to infect 8 to 9 other people. It is so infectious. We can have another one of those come along. So I'm hopeful that, as the vaccine comes and people do start to use it, it will quell down some of these kind of silly conspiracy theories that are out there. It is so infectious. We can have another one of those come along. So I'm hopeful.
We did do CEPI, which helped with some of the vaccine platforms, but not even 5% what we could have done. Then there's the period where the virus shows up in those first few months. What were the tests prepared? Did countries think through getting their ICU and ventilator capacity up? There'll be time for those postmortems. Very few countries are going to get an A grade for what that scrambling looked like. And now here we are. We didn't simulate this. We didn't practice. So both the health policies and economic policies, we find ourselves in uncharted territory.
I know one.
Good morning, and thank you all for being part of this Pandemic Emergency Board. We're at the start of what's looking like it will be a severe pandemic. And there are problems emerging that
straight into the first question that everybody would want me to ask. You delivered a TED Talk where you predicted pretty much what is happening now. Now, thanks to the world we live in, that has sprouted a bunch of conspiracy theories, everything from Bill Gates invented this virus to prove himself right, or he knew it was going to happen and that's why he said it. Was that TED Talk about this virus, or was that a hypothetical that has now come true?
Well, I didn't know specifically that it'd be coronavirus and that it would hit in late 2019. But the goal of the talk was to encourage governments to make the investments so we could respond very quickly and keep the case numbers very, very low. And so sadly, this is not a case where, I feel like, hey, I told you so. Because we didn't use that time.
You predicted this pandemic almost to a T, and maybe it was because we were dealing with other things at the time, we didn't really pay that much attention. Is there anything else you want to warn us about now that we should be looking forward to? Is there anything else that keeps you up at night?
Well, this is a naturally caused epidemic, and as bad as it is, it looks, if you have reasonable treatment, to have a 1% fatality. There could be epidemics that are worse than that, including ones that aren't naturally caused, that are a form of bioterrorism. But one thing I feel good about is this is such a big change to the world that this time
just about the time that I should have been thinking about retiring, I got the phone call from Seattle that Meg mentioned. There's a man here named Gates, they said, and he'd like to see you. And anyway, he gave us, within a few weeks, a few million to start a program in leadership, and for a 5-year program. And 1 year later, they called and said, look, we love your program. You have bigger ideas. What are they? And that's when we started the Institute. And it is not population control. That's a naughty word these days. It is the Bill and Melinda Gates Institute for Population and Reproductive Health, and it's based in the school, and of course I stayed on as its founding director.
would also reduce some of that overpopulation. Then we thought, wow, we can go full speed. And the science, it was a great time because the ability to invent new vaccines. That somebody says, oh, here's an antibody, make a lot of it, make it very quickly. That's right on the cutting edge. And the Ebola epidemic showed me that we're not ready for a serious epidemic. An epidemic that would be more infectious and would spread faster than Ebola did. This is the greatest risk of a huge tragedy. This is the most likely thing by far to kill over 10 million excess people in a year. We don't need to invest nearly what we do in military. A lot of things. We travel to Africa, meet with scientists. We see a lot of things that are going very well. Things like reducing childhood death and improving the nutrition. So it's a chance for us to share, why we're. Particularly anyone who has contact with older people or those at a greater risk. It will help us bring the numbers down. But, we don't know, are we going back to, say, 2,000 deaths a day like we were in April? That's hard to say. It's possible that we will. So 2020 is going to be a very tough year because the U.S. just hasn't been willing, which
this growing need to test for these antibodies in people, i.e. to see if someone had the disease and recovered. Maybe they didn't even know they had it. Because you could picture this growing worldwide force of heroes, let's call them heroes, who've been through this experience and have a lot to offer the world. Maybe they can offer, like blood donation, serum donation, but also other tasks. Like if you've got overwhelmed healthcare systems, presumably there are kind of community health worker type tasks that people could be trained to do to relieve the pressure there if we knew that they were effectively immune?
Yes, until we came up with the self-swab and showed FDA that that's equivalent, we were thinking the people who might be able to man those kiosks would be the recovered patients, because they could give the test, like 1 a minute versus somebody who had to change their protective gear, which is also in short supply, would take like 20 minutes per test. Now that we have the self-swab, we don't need it for that. But you're right. Recovered people are kind of magical. And, for key jobs, even where you might have some exposure, it might be useful Now, we don't want to have a lot of recovered people. You know, to be clear, we're trying through the shutdown in the United States to not get to 1% of the population infected.
Then the second time I saw him was the March after that, so March 2017 in the White House. In both of those two meetings, he asked me if vaccines weren't a bad thing, because he was considering a commission to look into ill effects of vaccines, and somebody, his name is Robert Kennedy Jr., was advising him that vaccines were causing bad things, and I said, no, that's a dead end. That would be a bad thing. Don't do that. Both times he wanted to know if there was a difference.
Of our investments, of all the investments we make in agriculture, and we make about $400 million in the sector, less than 5% of them are in the GMO technology, but we do believe it's something that ought to be available. One of the natural technologies is rice, a rice that is not GMO, that can be flood resistant, that is, sit in a field. When the rains come in Africa, a lot of rice is also grown in Africa. When the rains come, they're coming longer and for deeper periods. And so having a rice that's more flood resistant and can sit there in water for 2 or 3 weeks is also incredibly important. But we think that the Africans ought to get to decide which crops they grow in which ways and which seeds.
The strongest analogy is to medicines. And, you know, is there something to worry about with medicines? That is, might some of them have side effects? Do we need safety testing? I mean, and we're taking things that are, you know, genetically modified organisms, and we're injecting them in little kids' arms. We just shoot them right into the vein. So, yeah.
I know my husband is not vaccinating people and putting a microchip in her arm, because that technology doesn't even exist, and he's never uttered the words out of his mouth. So.
Are you aware that there are people out there who have these conspiracy theories that this was all created by you in order to inoculate everyone in the world and put a chip into their blood so you can track them?
Yeah, that's, you know, very strange.
Yes.
You know, that the organization that's about saving lives and warning, you know, gets attacked as though we were somehow connected to it.
Well, if you don't save our lives, you can't control our brains. Now, you say that the medicines or the
But I mean, let's talk about Regeneron. You've been optimistic about it. It got obviously a big endorsement from President Trump because he was able to receive it. He's calling it a cure. He's calling on regulators to give it emergency use authorization. Do you support the idea of the emergency use authorization? And I assume it's not a cure.
No, well, the word cure is a bit of an overpromise. You know, that makes it sound, it looks like works for everyone, and the whole concern about this disease should go away. And that's the last thing we want people to think about. The monoclonal antibodies, which is what Regeneron is, that's always been